The story unfolds within the quiet expanse of North America's ancient heartland, tracing the gentle rise and gradual fading of Cahokia, the great city of mounds. It moves slowly through its landscapes, its daily rhythms, its mysteries, and the soft echoes of a world now held mostly in earth and memory. In the long centuries before new maps reshaped the understanding of the continent, a broad and fertile plain spread out along the banks where the Mississippi River flowed with slow, unhurried force. Its waters moved through wide meanders, cutting across fields and woodlands, drifting past stands of oak and hickory that rose in calm, layered canopies. Morning light softened the horizon, brushing the tall grasses with a muted shimmer as dew gathered along each blade. Wildlife stirred gently in the underbrush, birds calling in low, melodic tones, insects tracing faint patterns through the warm air, and small animals rustling among fallen leaves. It was a landscape shaped by quiet abundance, where seasons turned with patient consistency, and the soil held a depth of richness formed over ages. Within this vast, steady environment, a great settlement gradually emerged, first as clusters of homes, then as a network of neighborhoods, and finally as a sprawling city whose presence stretched far across the floodplain. Earth was lifted basket by basket, forming long, sloping mounds that rose from the landscape like measured breaths of the earth itself. Some stood modest and rounded, while others rose higher with crisp angles and broad, flattened tops. From these elevated surfaces, the surrounding world appeared softened, the winding river catching sunlight in long silver bands, and the grasslands unfurling into the distance beneath a wide sky. Cahokia grew not in sudden bursts, but through the slow accumulation of daily labor, ritual gatherings, and generations of careful planning. Sounds echoed across the central plaza, soft murmurs of conversation, the rhythmic tapping of tools, the faint calls of traders arriving from distant places. Smoke drifted upward from hearths in gentle spirals, carrying the scent of roasted maize and damp wood. Pathways threaded between neighborhoods, curving toward mounds, fields, workshops, and ceremonial spaces. Life here unfolded in steady cycles shaped by planting schedules, flood seasons, and communal observances that marked the movement of time. In the calm hours of dawn, mist lingered close to the ground, wrapping the city in a soft haze that blurred its edges and made the mounds appear as natural extensions of the earth. As day unfolded, sunlight warmed the ground and cast shadows that moved slowly across the surfaces of packed earth and woven thatch. In the evenings, glow from hearth fires flickered gently through doorways, illuminating the woven mats, clay vessels, and wooden tools that filled each dwelling. Through these rhythms, the rising of the sun, the flow of the river, the shifting of seasons, the people of Cahokia lived, worked, built, and remembered. Their world, though now largely silent, once thrived with steady motion, layered traditions, and the subtle interplay of earth, water, and sky. It is within this quiet landscape that the story begins. Daily life in Cahokia unfolded with a slow, grounding rhythm that matched the measured pulse of the surrounding floodplain. At the heart of the settlement, fields stretched outward in broad patches, their rows of maize rising and falling with the seasons. The soil, rich and dark, retained the warmth of midday sunlight and released it gradually into the cool hours of evening. Workers moved through these fields with steady motions, tending crops, shaping irrigation channels, and observing the subtle signs that revealed the coming of rain or the shifting of the river's edge. Each task formed part of a continuous cycle that repeated year after year, binding the community to the land's natural patterns. The mornings began with gentle sounds, quiet footsteps on packed earth, the soft rustle of woven mats lifted aside, and the muted crackle of early fires coaxed into warmth. Smoke drifted slowly from hearths, rising through the openings of thatched roofs and scenting the air with the earthy aroma of damp wood. Homes clustered in calm, organized groups around courtyards, where tools rested against posts and vessels lay arranged with deliberate care. These courtyards served as a center of daily routine, where food was prepared, crafts were shaped, and conversations passed between families in low, unhurried tones. The architecture of Cahokia reflected both practicality and harmony with its environment. Houses built from wooden posts and covered with thick walls of woven reeds or clay appeared as modest, rounded silhouettes against the horizon. Their interiors remained cool even during summer heat, the walls shielding inhabitants from harsh sunlight. Inside, items crafted from bone, stone, clay, and wood rested in orderly arrangements, grinding stones smoothed by years of use, baskets woven tightly from local grasses, pots fired in quiet kilns near the edges of the settlement. These objects bore the marks of hands that shaped them slowly, each movement contributing to the material memory of daily life. Beyond the neighborhoods, paths extended toward the broad central plaza, where activity gathered in subtle waves. Traders arrived carrying goods from distant regions, shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, stone from remote quarries, and crafted ornaments shaped by skilled hands. Their arrival brought a muted hum to the air as people examined the objects, exchanged items, and shared news carried from beyond the horizon. The movement remained orderly and deliberate. Even gatherings that attracted larger groups retained a sense of calm, shaped by the unspoken understanding of ritual, community, and shared purpose. The great mounds rose steadily above these daily activities, their broad bases and sloping sides formed through countless hours of patient labor. Workers transported earth in woven baskets, climbing ramps in slow, measured lines that mirrored the rhythm of drum beats often heard during major construction periods. The weight of the earth rested heavily on shoulders and arms, yet the process unfolded without haste, guided by the knowledge that each layer contributed to structures meant to endure. Over time, these mounds became landmarks, places where ceremonies took shape, where leaders addressed the community, and where the cycles of the sun and seasons were observed from carefully aligned points. Life carried its difficulties, softened by the community's resilience. Summers brought intense humidity, insects moving through the warm air in persistent clouds, and storms that rolled across the plains with deep rumbles. Winters offered long stretches of cold wind sweeping across open ground. Flood seasons forced adjustments in planting and movement, as the river expanded its boundaries with patient force. Yet these challenges were familiar, woven into the fabric of daily living. They shaped routines and taught patterns of adaptation that passed calmly from one generation to the next. Evenings unfolded gently. As darkness settled over the landscape, fires cast warm glows across the courtyards, their light flickering against bundled reeds and clay surfaces. The city quieted into soft murmurs. the distant call of night birds, the rustling of tall grass in the wind, the muted steps of people returning from their final tasks. Within homes, warmth gathered slowly, illuminating the faces of families resting near the hearth, their conversations drifting like low currents of sound. The sky above stretched wide and clear, stars emerging in slow succession, their faint glimmer mirrored in the still waters of nearby ponds. In these calm, repeating patterns of labor, ceremony, and rest, the foundations of Cahokia were laid. The city did not rise in sudden bursts of activity. It expanded through countless small moments, through hands moving earth, through seeds planted in fertile soil, and through the quiet determination of those who made their homes in the shadow of the mounds. Their world grew not from conquest, but from patient collaboration with the land, the river, and the sky overhead. It is this steady rhythm, the hum of daily existence, that shaped the beginning of the great city. As seasons passed across the landscape, the cycles of Cahokian life deepened into familiar patterns that shaped the community's collective memory. Spring brought the soft rising of warm breezes and the slow awakening of the riverbanks, where new shoots of green appeared along the edges of marshy ground. The river swelled with meltwater from faraway lands, moving with a calm strength that carried driftwood, silt, and stories from distant regions. People moved through the fields with renewed purpose, smoothing soil that had shifted during winter and preparing the ground for another year of steady cultivation. The sound of tools tapping gently against earth drifted across the open spaces, blending with birdsong and the low sigh of wind moving through tall grasses. In the warm months that followed, the air grew dense with humidity, settling like a soft blanket over the settlement. The sun lingered high in the sky, casting long, warm rays across rooftops and illuminating the surfaces of clay vessels drying near hearths. Workers continued their tasks despite the heat, pacing themselves in slow, deliberate motions that matched the atmosphere's weight. Sweat gathered at brows and along arms, yet the effort remained unhurried. Each gesture contributed to the ongoing maintenance of the city, repairing walls, weaving baskets, shaping tools, and tending the fields that stretched outward in every direction. During this time, communal gatherings became more frequent. Families and neighbors met near the central plaza, exchanging news of planting success, weather patterns, and subtle shifts in the river's movement. Children moved between groups with quiet curiosity, carrying small bundles of reeds or clay figures shaped during moments of play. Their footsteps stirred dust that settled gently back onto the ground, forming soft layers that weathered beneath countless future steps. The air filled with subdued voices, creating a soft chorus that echoed faintly between the rising mounds. Autumn brought a shift in tone. The air cooled, carrying the scent of dried leaves and ripening maize. Harvest activities unfolded with steady coordination. Rows of corn husked beneath the open sky, bundles tied and carried toward storage pits lined with woven mats. Smoke rose from hearths where food was cooked in preparation for communal meals, marking the transition between seasons. The evenings grew quieter. The sky deepened into rich shades of orange and purple, and shadows lengthened across the landscape. Fires illuminated the interiors of homes with warm, flickering light that reflected off polished stone tools and smooth clay pots. Winter arrived with its own rhythm. Frost settled along the edges of pathways, and the river moved more slowly beneath thin sheets of ice near its banks. Families gathered closer to hearths, wrapped in layers of woven cloth to keep out the chill that crept through gaps in walls. The soundscape changed. Insects fell silent, bird calls softened, and the steady crackle of drying wood replaced the vibrancy of summer noise. Tasks turned inward, repairing tools worn by months of use, crafting new vessels, weaving mats from dried fibers, and preparing seeds for the coming spring. Even in winter, however, the mounds remained silent sentinels over the settlement. Their surfaces gathered frost and thin snow, creating gentle contours that caught early morning light. Paths leading toward them remained visible, trodden by those who performed rituals or carried offerings upward during the coldest months. The mounds shimmered softly during dawn, the frost melting into thin streaks that glistened beneath the rising sun. Through every season, life maintained a balance between effort and rest. The people of Cahokia understood the subtleties of their environment, not through written records, but through centuries of observation, memory, and shared experience. They watched the wind move through grasses and interpreted its signs. They noted the behavior of birds and animals, sensing the approach of storms or drought. They shaped their lives according to these patterns, adjusting quietly and without urgency. The settlement grew in complexity not through swift advancements, but through the slow accumulation of choices made by countless hands. Homes shifted position over generations. Fields expanded and contracted based on the river's meanders. Workshops appeared, producing items fashioned from materials sourced hundreds of miles away. Mounds rose steadily in response to ceremonial needs or the vision of leaders who shaped community memory through architecture. As night fell across the region, a stillness settled over the world. Fires diminished into glowing embers, their final warmth radiating across packed earth floors. The sky stretched outward in a vast display of stars, each point of light reflecting softly in the calm waters beyond the settlement. The mounds cast long silhouettes that blended into the darkness, appearing as quiet guardians of a community resting at the center of an ancient and enduring landscape. As generations passed within this broad and fertile region, the routines of Cahokia expanded into patterns that seemed to echo the steady rhythm of the earth itself. The city's pathways grew worn beneath countless footsteps, their surfaces compacted into firm, quiet trails, linking neighborhoods to fields, workshops, and ceremonial spaces. On misty mornings, these paths appeared faintly silvered under thin layers of dew, shimmering gently as the sun lifted above the horizon. People walked them with measured steps, carrying baskets filled with crops, tools smoothed by daily use, or bundles of reeds gathered from the riverbanks. Toward the outer edges of the settlement, the river's floodplain spread in wide, open expanses where grasses swayed in slow, undulating waves. The Mississippi moved with a calm force that rarely hurried, its currents broad and confident even during high water months. Families living near its banks knew its moods well. They observed the faint rise in water levels after distant storms, watched floating branches drift past in long, rhythmic lines, and adjusted their planting cycles to match the quiet messages carried by its current. The river did not offer certainty, yet its fluctuations were familiar, woven into the city's understanding of time. Workshops scattered throughout the settlement maintained their own subdued energy. Craftspeople shaped stone tools with steady tapping motions that filled the air with soft, rhythmic clicks. Others worked with bone or shell, rubbing surfaces until they grew smooth beneath practiced hands. Clay was gathered, kneaded, shaped, and set aside to dry in sheltered spaces before being placed near controlled fires that hardened it into vessels. The process unfolded without haste, guided by knowledge refined slowly through experience, passed from elders to apprentices. Each finished object bore marks of this careful continuity, patterns carved with quiet attention, polished surfaces warmed by touch, and forms shaped to fit daily needs. Near the central plaza, the atmosphere often shifted into one of subdued anticipation. Ceremonial preparations moved gently through the space as groups arranged items of symbolic importance. Feathers, carved figures, polished stones, and painted gourds. Ritual specialists stepped across the open ground with deliberate motions, carrying bundles wrapped in woven cloth. Drums, when used, echoed in slow, steady beats that reverberated across the plaza's grassy surface. The sound rose into the air like the measured beating of a distant heart, setting a calm cadence to the entire environment. Onlookers gathered quietly along the edges, watching smoke rise in thin, curling trails that drifted steadily upward. The mounds themselves held a presence that permeated daily life. Their silhouettes cut broad, gentle shapes into the skyline, visible from almost every corner of the settlement. People walked along their bases as they moved through their routines, the packed earth beneath their feet, carrying the weight of centuries. Ramps leading upward offered access to the flattened summits where meetings were held, signals were given, and ceremonies unfolded beneath the shifting sky. The elevated height created a vantage point from which the entire settlement appeared softened, its homes arranged like woven clusters set amid fields and waterways. From these heights, the slow smoke from hearths rose in pale strands, drifting and dissolving into the warm air. Even the natural world surrounding Cahokia played a part in shaping its calm atmosphere. Forests pressed gently at the edges of the cleared land, providing wood for building, fire, and tools. Their canopies offered cool shelter during the heat of summer, the air beneath them filled with the scent of damp soil and leaves warmed by sunlight. Wildlife moved quietly through the trees, deer stepping over fallen branches with careful grace, birds gliding between branches, and insects humming in steady patterns. Hunters walked through these woods in silence, their steady strides blending into the rhythm of the forest. Throughout each day, the changing light transformed the atmosphere of the settlement. Morning cast long, cool shadows that stretched from the mounds across the ground. Afternoon brought warm, golden hues that shimmered along the river's surface. By late evening, the sky deepened into rich shades of blue and violet, and the city's features softened beneath the dimming light. Fires burned more brightly, casting soft shapes against walls and illuminating woven mats spread near the hearth. Night enveloped the settlement in a gentle quiet, broken only by the rustling of wind through tall grass and the distant call of nocturnal birds. Life in Cahokia did not push forward in sudden bursts or dramatic changes. Instead, it unfolded in extended waves of repetition and adaptation, cycles of planting and harvesting, construction and rest, gathering and dispersing. These patterns extended across generations, shaping the identity of a settlement that grew into a city through the persistent, gentle efforts of its people. In this slow, grounded rhythm, the foundations of Cahokia took form, rising steadily from the plain and leaving traces that would linger long after the city itself receded into memory. As these cycles of work, ritual, and quiet resilience unfolded across the broad floodplain, the city continued to grow in subtle but unmistakable ways. Homes shifted, plazas widened, and mounds rose higher with each generation's patient labor. The landscape became a layered tapestry of paths, neighborhoods, and ceremonial spaces, all shaped by hands that rarely sought recognition but left enduring marks on the earth. Yet in the midst of these collective rhythms, certain individuals emerged whose presence guided the city's broader direction. Figures whose responsibilities stretched beyond daily tasks and who stepped carefully into roles shaped by tradition, expectation, and the steady weight of leadership. Their influence settled across Cahokia like a quiet undertone, felt not through force or spectacle, but through the measured decisions that shaped communal gatherings, agricultural cycles, and the ceremonial calendar. These individuals moved among the mounds with deliberate calm, carrying with them the knowledge of their ancestors and the subtle power entrusted to them by the community. Their lives stood at the meeting point between the practical needs of the settlement and the sacred obligations that tied the city to the sky above, the river beside it, and the earth beneath its foundations. Among these leaders, one figure rose to particular significance. His presence felt throughout the plazas and neighborhoods, even as his footsteps remained soft upon the ground. His story was woven into the city's growth, shaped by the responsibilities he bore and the expectations placed upon him by generations of tradition. It is within his life, quiet, weighty, and deeply connected to the rhythms of Cahokia, that the next part of this narrative unfolds. Across the broad landscape where Cahokia rose in layered silhouettes of earth and sky, the presence of leadership settled not in loud proclamations or defined symbols, but in quiet gestures, subtle gatherings, and the calm, continuous flow of responsibility. Out of the many individuals who shaped the city's life, one figure existed at the center of its ceremonial and political rhythm. His days unfolded not in solitude, but in the soft shadow of expectation, an expectation carried gently by those who lived beneath the mounds, who planted the fields, who tended the fires, and who shaped the objects used in daily observance. His role emerged from long-standing tradition, from inherited memory, and from the belief that the city's harmony depended on guidance rooted in both earth and sky. His residence, perched upon one of the rising mounds overlooking the central plaza, stood as a modest structure of wood and thatch, softened by years of weather and care. Morning light brushed its sides with warm hues, and shadows from nearby posts and trees stretched slowly across the summit. From this height, the city extended outward in every direction. Workers moving through fields, traders circling toward workshops, smoke rising from hearths in faint streams that dissolved into the quiet air. These sights reached him each day as he stepped from his dwelling, the calm breeze carrying with it the sense of damp earth, harvested maize, and wood smoke from distant fires. His responsibilities were many, though none moved with urgency. Each task unfolded with deliberate slowness, guided by the need to maintain balance rather than enforce authority. Meetings with advisors took place beneath the shade of the mound's elevated roof, where mats were arranged in neat patterns and carved wooden objects rested between participants. Discussions centered on seasonal predictions, crop yields, ceremonial preparation, and diplomatic matters with distant settlements connected by river and forest. Voices remained low and measured, rising only slightly when emphasis was needed. These conversations drifted outward into the open air, carried across the height of the mound by the steady wind. In addition to domestic matters, the leader performed rituals tied to the movement of celestial bodies. On certain mornings, he walked toward aligned positions near the great wooden circle known as woodhenge. The posts cast long shadows across the earth, each one marking a point of astronomical significance. Standing at the alignment where solstice sunrise or equinox light struck the circle in perfect balance, he observed the sky with patient attention. The quiet stillness of these ceremonies carried deep meaning, connecting his presence to the cycles that framed the city's existence. The people of Cahokia believed that harmony between the heavens and the earth was sustained through such observances, and that the leader's calm witness anchored the city within those cycles. His role also required engagement with ritual specialists who dedicated their lives to understanding the symbolic language of the natural world. These individuals, often cloaked in garments dyed with muted plant pigments, arrived at the mound summit carrying objects wrapped in cloth. Feathers, carved effigies, polished stones, and painted gourds. They spread these items before him in gentle arcs, each object representing an aspect of water, earth, sky, or ancestral spirit. With slow, careful gestures, they describe signs observed in the floodplain, the arrival of certain birds, the patterns of fish near the riverbank, the behavior of animals in the forest. Such signs offered subtle guidance for both ceremonial timing and agricultural cycles. Though the leader's life carried the weight of ritual and responsibility, it did not isolate him from the community. At intervals throughout the year, he descended the mound steps and walked the pathways among the people. His presence brought no alarm, only a quiet shift in movement as families paused their work, offering respectful bows or soft greetings. He observed the progress in fields, the construction of homes, the activities at workshops where stone tools or ceramic vessels were crafted. These observations, made with calm interest, shaped decisions that guided resource distribution, labor organization, and ceremonial offerings. His understanding of the city remained grounded in the daily experiences of its inhabitants. During major gatherings, the leader took a central position on the elevated mound platforms where speeches were delivered, not with force, but with slow, resonant tones that carried across the plaza. The people gathered in wide arcs, forming still, attentive lines beneath the open sky. Drums sounded in deep, steady rhythms, their beats spreading across the ground like a pulse binding the community. In these moments, his words blended with the environment, melding into the rustling of grass, the distant calls of birds, and the low hum of wind flowing across rooftops. The message conveyed stability, continuity, and the reaffirmation of communal ties. Certain seasons brought more intense ceremonial duties. In preparation for harvest celebrations or solstice observances, the leader oversaw processions that wound through pathways connecting mounds, plazas, and ceremonial posts. Participants carried objects of symbolic importance, lifting them gently above their shoulders or holding them at chest level as they moved in slow formations. Painted patterns on their skin shimmered in sunlight, their colors softened by dust rising from the ground. The leader walked at the forefront or center, depending on the ritual, his pace unchanging, his expression serene beneath the unfolding sequence. To the people, these processions offered reassurance, evidence that ancestral traditions remained intact. Even in moments of challenge, his demeanor held the quiet steadiness expected of his position. When river levels rose unexpectedly or crops showed signs of stress, he met with advisors to interpret natural indicators and adjust communal actions. Their discussions did not reflect panic. Instead, they carried tones of contemplation, grounded in long-standing knowledge of seasonal variability. Decisions followed a slow unraveling of thought, shaped by the understanding that the land itself carried the memory of such fluctuations. Through his calm presence, the community found reassurance that their stability rested not on sudden solutions, but on the gradual wisdom inherited over generations. At night, the leader often remained awake after others had returned to their homes. Sitting near a small fire atop the mound, he watched the sky shift from pale twilight to deep indigo. Stars appeared in increasing numbers, spreading across the heavens in patterns studied by ceremonial observers. The quiet crackle of burning wood accompanied his reflections, blending with the faint night sounds rising from the settlement below. In these solitary hours, he contemplated the continuity between ancestors and descendants, between the cycles of the celestial world and the steady rhythm of the earth. The fire's glow illuminated his features in soft, warm tones, drawing long shadows across the wooden floorboards. When illness or age began to touch his frame, the city adapted to accommodate his slowing pace. Assistants walked beside him during processions, supporting him with unobtrusive steadiness. Meetings with advisors took place in shaded areas on mound summits, where breezes offered relief from heat. His presence remained central, even as physical strength diminished, for leadership in Cahokia rested not on speed or force, but on wisdom refined by time. The community understood this, continuing to look toward the mound summit for guidance even as the leader's movements grew more measured. His final days unfolded in tranquility. Fires burned low near his dwelling, offering warmth through cool nights. Ritual specialists remained close, conducting quiet ceremonies that honored the continuity of lineage and the cyclical nature of time. When he passed, the city did not erupt into sudden mourning. Instead, a gentle solemnity settled across the landscape. People moved with lowered voices, placing offerings at the bases of mounds, weaving objects of symbolic significance, and leaving small bowls of food in designated spaces. The air carried a softened stillness, shaped by both grief and gratitude. His burial, conducted with deliberate care, reflected the reverence held for his role. Priests and attendants arranged symbolic items beside him, objects representing sky, earth, water, and the ancestral world. The earth covered these items in patient layers, creating a burial that melded into the surrounding mound with seamless continuity. Over time, the surface smoothed, grass grew across the summit, and the wind whispered across it, just as it had for generations. In the years that followed, his memory lingered not through grand monuments or individual legends, but through the continued rhythms of the city he once guided. The mounds stood as silent reminders of his presence, and the river continued its measured flow past the floodplain. New leaders arose, stepping into the roles shaped by tradition, carrying forward the calm responsibilities he once held. Through the passing of seasons, his influence remained woven into the city's identity, forming a quiet thread in the long tapestry of Cahokia's existence. In the seasons after his passing, the memory of the old ruler softened into the rhythms of daily life. Yet his presence continued to shape the city in ways both subtle and enduring. The mound on which he had lived gained a new stillness, its summit cleared of ceremonial objects, its pathways brushed by the footsteps of those who ascended to reflect quietly upon the continuity of leadership. Grass grew in soft patterns across its surface, swaying gently with the wind as if echoing the slow cadence of his former steps. Even the air around the mound seemed to carry a faint echo of his measured voice, as though the countless gatherings he had overseen had imprinted themselves upon the atmosphere. The new leader who assumed his responsibilities emerged from long-standing traditions rather than sudden change. His transition into the role brought no disruption, only a continuation of the slow, ceremonial processes that had defined the city for generations. Ritual specialists counseled him, elders stood beside him, and families watched respectfully from their doorways as he made his first walk across the central plaza. His pace matched the city's calm rhythm, each step placed with the same care that had characterized his predecessor. No proclamation marked his accession. Instead, the community recognized the shift through the quiet alignment of roles and responsibilities that settled around him like a gentle mantle. This new figure, though different in temperament, carried the same weight of expectation. Days began before dawn with a slow ascent to the mound summit, where he observed the horizon as the sky brightened in muted colors. The fields below stirred into life as workers emerged from their homes, their movements blending into the larger rhythm that shaped each morning. From his elevated vantage point, he could see the full spread of the settlement, the gentle lines of pathways, the clusters of homes, the faint smoke rising from early fires. These sights formed a tapestry of continuity, reminding him that leadership rested not on dramatic decisions, but on the quiet understanding of how each part of the settlement carried meaning. In his role, he visited distant neighborhoods, stepping onto narrow paths that passed between rows of homes. Children watched with hushed curiosity as he walked. Elders greeted him with nods softened by age, and craftspeople paused their work briefly as he observed their progress. He listened to concerns expressed in soft voices, questions about river levels, observations about shifts in bird migration, and requests for reassignment of resources. His responses flowed with the same deliberate pacing, shaped by the belief that each problem held its answer within the patterns of land and sky. During major festivals, he became the center of ceremonies that unfolded with slow, layered symbolism. The processions leading toward the central plaza grew elaborate under his guidance, incorporating new elements drawn from distant communities along the river. Drums reverberated in deep, steady pulses, creating a soundscape that filled the open space with tranquil resonance. Painted dancers moved in careful arcs, carrying decorated staffs or feathered fans that fluttered gently in the quiet breeze. The leader, standing near the edge of a mound platform, listened to the chants, and responded with gestures learned from ritual specialists. These ceremonies reinforced unity, connecting each household to the city's ancestral past. As years passed, he developed a particular interest in the alignments between mounds, plazas, and the movement of the sun. With the assistance of astronomer priests, he spent long afternoons observing how shadows shifted across the ground during solstice and equinox seasons. They placed small markers at key points, gradually refining the understanding of how architecture could reflect celestial order. This quiet collaboration resulted in the construction of additional posts at Woodhenge, extending the circle and creating a more refined sequence of sightlines. On certain mornings, villagers gathered to witness the alignment of sunlight with the posts, watching as the first rays illuminated the leader's silhouette with soft, golden light. In quieter periods, he retreated to shaded areas beneath trees near the riverbank. Here, he met with traders arriving by canoe, their vessels laden with goods from distant regions, stone from the Ozarks, shells from the Gulf, sparkling mica sheets from the Appalachian foothills. Conversations unfolded in low, even tones as traders described the places they had traveled, the conditions of river routes, and the items they sought in exchange. These interactions broadened the leader's understanding of the world beyond Cahokia, revealing a network of communities connected by slow-moving water and long-established paths. As his own age advanced, he found increasing comfort in the quiet spaces of the city. The summit of the mound served as a place of reflection, its height offering uninterrupted views of sunsets that wash the sky in pale oranges and deep purples. The fading light cast the long shadows of the mounds across the landscape, emphasizing their presence as both landmarks and living memory. In these moments, the leader contemplated the city's past, observing how each generation contributed to the shape of Cahokia in both visible and unseen ways. He grew slower in movement, yet his presence remained steady. Advisors accompanied him on walks, offering support with quiet gestures. People continued to look toward him during ceremonies, trusting his ability to interpret the signs revealed by the natural world. Through health and weakness, through seasons of abundance and seasons of strain, he carried forward the lineage established by those before him. And as his life reached its later stages, another transition began to form, softly, almost imperceptibly, within the quiet of the ceremonial circles and the patient rise of the mounds. His legacy, like that of his predecessor, awaited its place within the earth, to be carried forward not through legend, but through the patterns he shaped and the harmony he helped preserve. As another turning of seasons unfolded across the city, the leader's influence continued to shape the cadence of Cahokia's communal life. The settlement swelled and contracted like a breathing organism, new households forming at its edges, older ones shifting closer to the central mounds, and the patterns of life flowing with the subtle force of tides, pushing gently inward and outward. Amid these shifting boundaries, the leader remained a constant presence, his actions forming a quiet anchor that held the sprawling settlement in steady alignment. During the warm months, when the fields glimmered beneath the weight of ripening maize, he traveled with advisors to observe the landscape's subtle transformations. They moved along earthen paths bordered by tall green stalks, the leaves rustling softly in the breeze like faint whispers rising from the ground. The leader paused often, leaning slightly on a carved wooden staff worn smooth from years of use. He examined the soil's texture, the color of the leaves, the distant shimmer of moisture along the river's edge. His advisors observed alongside him, sometimes exchanging muted commentary as they interpreted these signs through inherited knowledge. These outings were never hurried. Each moment held space for careful observation and reflection. As the group walked, workers looked up from their tasks with calm acknowledgement. Their motions slowed briefly before returning to the rhythm of their work, turning soil, securing irrigation channels, bundling harvested reeds. The leader's quiet arrival carried no disruption. Rather, it blended seamlessly into the ongoing cadence of field labor. He offered no grand declarations, only small gestures and soft-spoken guidance that addressed the unfolding needs of the season. These interactions strengthened the bond between leadership and daily life, ensuring that decisions rested on the lived realities of the community rather than distant abstraction. In the workshops scattered throughout the settlement, the leader often found moments of contemplative connection. He walked among potters shaping large storage vessels, their hands moving in circular patterns around the rotating clay. He paused by stoneworkers who tapped patiently at raw materials, producing flakes that glimmered briefly before joining piles of sharpened fragments. He observed weavers who looped reeds into intricately patterned mats, their fingers moving with practiced ease. These workshops emitted distinct soundscapes, rhythmic tapping, the soft scrape of clay smoothing beneath palms, the gentle snapping of fibers woven into place. The leader absorbed these sounds with quiet appreciation, recognizing them as threads in the larger fabric of the city's existence. When traders arrived from distant regions, their canoes gliding toward Cahokia along the broad river, the leader listened attentively to the stories they brought. Reports of storms encountered during travel, sightings of unusual animals, or small shifts in the cultural practices of neighboring settlements. These exchanges unfolded beneath the shade of tall trees near the water's edge, where the air carried a faint scent of mud and wildflowers. The leader offered crafted goods in return, decorated pottery, polished stone tools, carefully woven textiles, further strengthening the silent network of exchange that linked the Mississippian world across hundreds of miles. Every traded item carried with it not only material value, but a subtle sense of connection between distant communities. Evenings brought long moments of contemplation atop the mound. As the sun dissolved into the horizon, casting streaks of gold and rose across the sky, the leader walked slowly around the summit. The world below softened into blurred hues as light faded, leaving the settlement bathed in the warm glow of fires that flickered through the doorways of homes. Smoke drifted upward in thin ribbons, blending with the cool night air. The leader took in these sights with a calm gaze, listening to the faint rhythm of drums sounding from a distant courtyard where families prepared for small communal gatherings. These scenes stirred in him a deep awareness of the continuity that connected past generations with those yet to come. Certain nights carried a heightened stillness that seemed to invite reflection. On such evenings, the leader stepped beyond the boundaries of the mound and walked toward the wooden posts of the great calendar circle. The posts rose from the earth like silent sentinels, their surfaces darkened by time, yet still aligned precisely with celestial movements. moonlight drifted across their tops, creating faint lines of brightness along their edges. Standing in the center of the circle, the leader watched the sky shift in slow arcs, constellations emerging from the growing darkness. The night wind brushed gently against his clothing, carrying with it the scents of grass and river water. In these moments, the city felt suspended in timeless balance, as though the sky's vast calmness had settled gently upon every rooftop and mound. As his responsibilities grew more complex with age, the leader increasingly relied on the council of ritual specialists. They met during calm afternoons beneath sheltered roofs, where soft light filtered through woven screens and illuminated painted gourds arranged in ceremonial sequences. The specialists spread bundles of herbs, carved effigies representing animal spirits, and thin copper sheets shaped into symbolic forms. Their discussions unfolded at a deliberate pace. Interpretations of dreams, readings of seasonal signs, and preparations for upcoming ceremonies. The leader listened with attention, his thoughts weaving carefully through their recommendations as he shaped decisions meant to sustain the city's harmony. Despite the growing weight of years, the leader retained a gentle strength that continued to reassure the community. During large gatherings at the central plaza, he stood upon the mound's edge with an even posture, his garments moving softly in the wind. Thousands gathered below, their presence forming a quiet sea across the open space. The leader's voice rose in calm, steady tones that carried just enough weight to reach the far edges of the gathering. His words did not seek to inspire or command. Instead, they reaffirmed the continuity that had guided the community through countless seasons. The people listened in silence, their stillness forming a unified response that drifted upward like the steady flow of incense smoke. These scenes defined the latter years of his life, moments of reflection, gentle leadership, deepened understanding, and the quiet transmission of tradition. As time progressed, his movements slowed, but his presence remained central to the unfolding life of Cahokia. The city adapted to his pace, just as it adapted to the shifting river, the changing sky, and the whispering movements of the forest. Through every transition, the leader served as the calm bridge between past and present, grounding the community in both memory and hope. And so, in the lingering warmth of many summers and the softened light of countless winters, his legacy expanded, not through dramatic shifts or grand monuments, but through the steady, rhythmic patterns he helped preserve. The mounds rose as guardians of his memory, and the city continued its life beneath their silent watch, shaped by the quiet authority he had offered for so many years. As the years continued their slow progression, the memory of the leaders who shaped Cahokia settled into the mounds and plazas like layers of fine silt drifting to the floor of a quiet river. Their decisions, gestures, and rituals lingered in the air long after their footsteps faded from the summit paths. Wind brushed gently across the broad earthworks they once climbed, carrying faint traces of ceremonies held beneath changing skies. The city remained anchored in these memories, each generation inheriting its rhythms through unspoken understanding and the enduring presence of the landscape itself. Yet, even as daily life unfolded with steady familiarity, certain elements of Cahokia existed beyond the reach of communal memory. Structures built with deliberate precision, objects placed in careful patterns, and alignments traced across open ground carried meanings that slipped gradually into obscurity. Over time, their original purpose grew softer, their significance left to the quiet interpretations of observers who approached them with reverence and curiosity. These places, marked by earth, wood, stone, and open sky, held mysteries that continued to whisper across centuries. It is toward these mysteries that the narrative now turns, moving from the personal legacy of leadership to the broader, more enigmatic traces left by those who lived and worked within Cahokia's ceremonial heart. What remains in the soil, beneath the mounds, and across the floodplain offers glimpses into beliefs, practices, and structures whose meanings unfolded in silence. Through these remnants, the city communicates across time, inviting contemplation of the unknown layers woven into its ancient design. Long after ceremonies concluded, long after leaders stepped down from the summits of the great mounds for the final time, Cahokia's landscape remained layered with symbols and structures whose full meanings drifted beyond the reach of memory. These remnants endured not through written records, but through earth, wood, and stone, materials shaped by hands now gone, placed with intention, and anchored in patterns that invited contemplation. Over centuries, as winds swept across the floodplain and grasses grew over older paths, these structures shifted from practical and ceremonial tools into enigmatic echoes of a world that spoke through form, alignment, and soil. The most striking among these mysteries rose quietly from the open ground to the west of Monk's Mound, where tall wooden posts once formed a great circle, an arrangement now known as woodhenge. Its structure appeared simple at first glance, a wide ring of evenly spaced posts, each placed into the earth with deliberate care. But beneath this simplicity lay a complexity of alignment, purpose, and meaning understood deeply by the people who constructed it, and faintly glimpsed by those who studied it long after the city fell silent. When Woodhenge stood in its full form, the circle stretched across the landscape like an immense clock of earth and sky. Observers positioned at its center could watch the rising sun pass through gaps between posts, marking solstices, equinoxes, and significant points along the horizon. Morning light filtered through these wooden sentinels, drawing bright lines across the packed earth and illuminating the air with pale gold. In the stillness of dawn, the shadows cast by the posts reached toward the city's mounds, connecting celestial movement with the human-built world in a single, unhurried sequence. Each post held a place within the larger logic of the sky, reflecting a detailed understanding of the cycles that governed both ritual and agricultural life. Over time, the earth beneath Woodhenge softened as posts decayed, leaving behind faint stains that later archaeologists would uncover. These stains, dark ovals in pale soil, were quiet signatures of the structure's former grandeur. By examining their positions, researchers reconstructed the shape and purpose of the circle, realizing that astronomical observation played a foundational role in Cahokia's ceremonial life. Yet many questions lingered: whether processions circled the posts, whether songs accompanied sunrise rituals, whether certain points represented ancestral spirits, or whether each alignment held layers of meaning lost to time. The answers dissolved into the landscape, preserved only as hints carried by the remains. Other mysteries unfolded beneath the mounds themselves. As centuries passed, Archaeological excavations revealed chambers and layers built with intention far beyond simple burial or storage. Beneath some mounds lay platforms of woven matting, clay surfaces pressed into smooth plains, and layers of ash indicating ritual fires that once burned with slow intensity. In some areas, traces of colored pigments, reds, yellows, and blacks, clung to soil, suggesting painted designs or symbolic arrangements long faded from visibility. Stone tools, shell beads, and fragments of copper ornaments appeared within these layers, each object placed with purpose at the moment of its burial. Though the meanings of these placements remain unclear, the consistency across multiple sites implies a shared ceremonial language understood deeply by the people of Cahokia. One of the most intriguing discoveries lay within a burial mound, containing the remains of a figure surrounded by a wealth of symbolic objects. Shell beads arranged in the shape of a falcon outlined a form that suggested spiritual or political significance. Nearby, offerings crafted from copper and mica lay in careful arrangements, their reflective surfaces dimmed by centuries beneath the soil. Surrounding the central figure were individuals whose positions and grave goods suggested roles interpreted through ritual meaning. The entire burial seemed to function as both resting place and ceremonial narrative, an unspoken story recorded in the earth. Yet the details of that narrative, the full meaning behind each object and arrangement, remained gently out of reach. Other mounds revealed layers of construction that pointed toward repeated rebuilding, as if each generation renewed the surface in honor of events or individuals. These layers formed a vertical history of the city, compressed soil and clay stacked like pages in a book written without words. Archaeologists reading these layers traced the evolution of ceremonial structures over time, noting shifts in building techniques, changes in ritual offerings, and the movement of public plazas in response to natural and social cycles. The story told through these layers was one of adaptation, continuity, and devotion to a cosmology that fused earth with sky, people with ancestors, and ritual with daily life. Artifacts uncovered in domestic areas offered their own quiet puzzles. Incised pottery fragments bore geometric patterns whose meanings remain uncertain, possibly tied to clan symbols, mythological concepts, or seasonal observances. Small stone figurines appeared in unexpected locations, their features smoothed by handling, yet the significance of their forms eluded interpretation. Were they objects of personal devotion, teaching tools, or representations of ancestral beings? The answers remained soft, hidden behind the gentle erosion of centuries. Excavations near workshops uncovered stones with shallow grooves worn into their surfaces, suggesting tools used to grind pigments for painting bodies, pottery, or ceremonial structures. Fragments of these pigments still clung to the stones: deep red ochre, bright yellow earth, and charcoal black. These colors likely played a central role in rituals now lost to memory, perhaps marking the faces of dancers who moved beneath the moonlight, or decorating objects carried through the plaza in solemn ceremonial lines. Beyond the central city, remnants of wooden palisades stretched across the floodplain. These tall walls, constructed from sharpened logs, once encircled key areas of Cahokia. Their presence suggested a need for controlled access or ceremonial division rather than warfare. Over centuries, the wood decayed and fell inward, leaving only soil discolorations to mark their paths. The palisades raised questions about the social boundaries within the city. Who passed through their gates, under what circumstances, and with what significance? The answers remain suspended in silence, preserved only by these faint traces. Even the city's layout held mysteries that encouraged contemplation. The alignment of mounds, plazas, and causeways appeared too deliberate to be random. Long, straight paths connected various ceremonial centers, suggesting a symbolic geography shaped by cosmological principles. Scholars debated whether the city mirrored constellations, honored seasonal cycles, or reflected mythic narratives now lost. In each interpretation, the landscape served as a canvas upon which the Cahokians recorded their understanding of the universe. A map built of packed earth, wooden posts, and open spaces. The river, too, played a role in Cahokia's mysteries. Channels and levees indicated deliberate efforts to shape water flow, guiding its movement toward fields and ceremonial ponds. These ponds, filled with still water, reflected not only surrounding structures, but also the sky above, creating a mirrored surface that may have served a ritual function. A calm breeze could disturb the reflection, sending ripples across the shimmering surface and transforming it into a living symbol of change and continuity. Why these ponds were placed where they were and what ceremonies unfolded at their edges remain questions open to gentle speculation. In quieter areas beyond the central plaza, excavation revealed charred remnants of feasting events, heaps of animal bones, piles of burned corn cobs, and broken pottery vessels carefully arranged in pits. These gatherings, held at intervals throughout the year, likely carried layers of meaning tied to harvest cycles, political alliances, or ancestral remembrance. While the specific purposes remain unclear, the evidence suggests occasions when large groups of people gathered to share food, reaffirm social ties, and participate in rituals that fortified the community. These feasts, though silent in the archaeological record, once filled the air with soft laughter, drum beats, and the scent of roasting food. The greatest mystery, however, lay in Cahokia's gradual decline. Over time, the city's population dispersed, its plazas grew quiet, and its mounds settled into stillness beneath layers of soil and grass. The reasons remain uncertain, perhaps a combination of shifting climate, resource strain, political change, or altered ceremonial needs. Whatever the cause, the departure unfolded gently rather than abruptly. Homes were abandoned without signs of conflict. Tools were left behind in places suggesting peaceful withdrawal. The city did not collapse in dramatic ruin. It faded, softened by time, reclaimed gently by the earth. Today, the mysteries of Cahokia whisper through the landscape, in the shallow depressions of ancient post holes, in the layered soils beneath the mounds, in the fragments of painted pottery and polished stone. A quiet voice speaks from the past. It calls not for excitement or urgency, but for calm observation, a recognition that some stories survive through traces, not through full explanation. These mysteries invite reflection rather than resolution, allowing the mind to drift along the edges of what remains known and what has slipped softly. Beyond the visible structures and the carefully arranged remnants recovered from the soil, the landscape around Cahokia held other, quieter traces. Marks left not by monumental building or ceremonial gatherings, but by the subtle passage of countless ordinary moments. These traces were delicate, preserved only where chance protected them from the shifting river, and the restless motion of time. They revealed glimpses of stories that existed at the edges of memory, offering hints of lives lived in harmony with a world that no longer carried their names. In some areas near the outer neighborhoods, shallow depressions indicated the presence of ancient garden beds, their shapes faint but discernible in the softened contours of the earth. These beds, arranged with a gentle regularity, suggested the cultivation of plants beyond the staple crops grown in larger fields. Herbs, flowers, and ritual plants may have grown here, their leaves once brushed by hands that tended them carefully at dawn or dusk. Though the plants themselves vanished long ago, the soil still held their imprint, subtle traces of nutrients altered by roots that wove quietly through the ground. These ghostly garden patterns hinted at domestic rituals now forgotten, intimate forms of care that once linked daily life with sacred practice. Nearby, post-hole arrangements hinted at small structures whose purposes remain uncertain. Some appeared too slight for homes, their footprints too small and delicate. Perhaps they sheltered tools or provided shaded corners for weaving and pottery work. Others formed narrow enclosures with no clear entryways, their alignments matching neither domestic architecture nor known ceremonial forms. These enigmatic structures stood like quiet questions, their intentions blurred by time. Archaeologists traced their outlines with careful precision, yet the full meaning behind their placement remained softly veiled. In the quieter outskirts of the settlement, refuse pits revealed layers of discarded items, broken pots, cracked stones, worn tools. Each layer told a subtle story of shifting needs and changing techniques. Pottery styles evolved slowly across generations, their designs altering in small increments that mirrored technological refinement and aesthetic preference. Some vessels bore incised patterns in flowing lines, while others displayed geometric symmetry. The variety suggested a complex cultural landscape where individual creators expressed their understanding of form and meaning through subtle artistic decisions. These vessels, though broken, retained a gentle beauty in their curves and patterns, their forms echoing the hands that shaped them centuries before. At the edges of the floodplain, patches of land bore thin scattering of fire-cracked rock, evidence of cooking hearths that once warmed families on cool nights. These stones, darkened and split by heat, lay in loose clusters across the ground. Their presence suggested gatherings that may have taken place outside the main settlement, moments when small groups traveled to the river's edge to fish, cook, or rest beneath the shade of nearby trees. The rocks remained where they fell after meals long forgotten, their shapes altering slowly with rain and frost. Each one carried the memory of warmth long extinguished, quiet echoes of laughter, conversation, and calm evening hours. Other clues lay buried deeper, accessible only through careful excavation. Under layers of settled earth, archaeologists uncovered small caches of carefully arranged objects, bundles of reeds tied together with plant fibers, collections of smoothed stones arranged in arcs, and fragments of gourds filled with dried seeds. These caches appeared intentional, placed in pits with a ritualistic precision that suggested offerings or symbolic markers. Their purposes, however, resisted full understanding. Some may have been placed to mark transitions, birth, harvest, initiation, while others perhaps honored ancestral spirits or natural forces. Whatever their meaning, The quiet intentionality behind each arrangement spoke of a worldview that fused daily life with the unseen. Even the soil itself held subtle signatures. Pollen grains, preserved for centuries in damp pockets of earth, revealed the presence of plants no longer found in the region. Their shapes, examined under magnification, testified to the diversity of Cahokia's environment. Some pollen belonged to plants cultivated for food, others to wildflowers, likely used in ceremonies or decoration. The presence of exotic pollen suggested travel or trade, carried by winds or woven into ceremonial offerings brought from distant communities. In this way, even microscopic remnants hinted at connections that stretched beyond the horizon. In areas where the ground sloped gently toward marshlands, the remains of wooden walkways occasionally emerged during excavation. These narrow paths, constructed from split logs laid side by side, once enabled movement across muddy terrain. Over time, the wood softened, darkened, and eventually sank beneath layers of silt, yet enough of their form survived to reveal a practical ingenuity. Such walkways suggested gatherings near the marsh's edge, possibly for harvesting reeds, collecting fish, or conducting rituals that required proximity to water. The presence of these pathways hinted at aspects of Cahokia's life that unfolded away from the central mounds, in spaces where the boundary between land and water remained in constant gentle motion. Further east, slight depressions shaped like elongated basins suggested the presence of ancient pits lined with clay. Soil samples from these depressions contained traces of minerals associated with pigment processing, suggesting that the basins functioned as workshops for creating colors used in rituals or body painting. It is easy to imagine specialists kneeling beside these basins, grinding ochres into fine powder, mixing pigments with water or oil, and applying the resulting colors to objects now lost. The memory of these crafts lingered in the Earth's subtle chemistry, revealing a world where artistry and ceremony intertwined in quiet, deliberate motions. Some of the most intriguing mysteries appeared not in material objects, but in the empty spaces between structures. Large open plazas stretched across the settlement, their surfaces carefully maintained. These spaces, devoid of permanent buildings, suggested communal gatherings whose nature can only be inferred through traces left on the ground. Packed earth hardened by thousands of footsteps, charcoal fragments from fires long extinguished, and faint outlines of temporary posts that once supported shelters or ritual screens. In these vast clearings, the people of Cahokia likely gathered for processions, dances, storytelling, and observances tied to celestial events. The plazas acted as stages for collective memory, yet their most profound meanings evaporated as the last voices faded across the grass. Even the mounds themselves held layers of unanswered questions. Excavations revealed that many were constructed in phases, one layer of earth placed atop another, sometimes with deliberate pauses between building episodes. These pauses may have reflected shifts in leadership, major ritual events, or changes in the community's spiritual needs. The reasons behind the timing and structure of these layers remain elusive, giving rise to interpretations that hover gently between archaeological evidence and respectful speculation. Each mound, in its depth and complexity, held stories that stretched beyond its visible form, woven into the soil by hands that worked with patience and intention. These mysteries extended into the deepest parts of Cahokia's history, where the boundary between physical evidence and spiritual meaning dissolved into soft uncertainty. The city stood not only as a center of economic and political life, but as a vast ceremonial landscape whose symbols were written across earth, water, and sky. Though modern observers can reconstruct its shape, measure its features, and analyze its remnants, the inner world of Cahokia, the symbolic universe that ordered its rituals, inspired its art, and guided its leaders, remains a quiet presence beneath the soil. What emerges from these subtle traces is not a set of final answers, but a gentle invitation to reflect on the lives that once shaped this place. Each artifact, each post hole, each soil stain speaks in soft tones, offering glimpses into a world both familiar and distant. Through these mysteries, Cahokia continues to communicate across centuries, whispering its stories through the ground itself, preserving just enough detail to inspire wonder while leaving space for contemplation. As the traces of Cahokia's hidden meanings settled deeper into the earth, the city's landscape continued to hold a balance between the seen and the unseen. The remnants of wooden circles, buried offerings, painted vessels, and layered mounds revealed only fragments of a world shaped by careful observation and quiet ceremony. Yet alongside these mysteries existed another dimension of Cahokia's life, one not concealed beneath soil or softened by time, but lived in the open spaces atop the mounds, within the shaded enclosures of ceremonial structures, and along the orderly paths that connected centers of authority. While the rhythms of daily labor and the enigmatic patterns of ritual left their marks in the archaeological record, another set of stories unfolded in the elevated spaces where leaders, priests, and high-status families shaped the city's course. These individuals lived at a measured distance from the wider population, their daily routines intertwined with the sacred frameworks that guided community identity. Their homes stood upon higher ground, their movements carried symbolic weight, and their responsibilities stretched far beyond their own households. In their presence, the city's ceremonial geometry took on a living form. Through their quiet deliberations, offerings, and rituals, the ideals of Cahokia were translated into action. And so, the narrative shifts gently from the hidden traces beneath the earth to the elevated world above it, from mysteries preserved in silence to the structured lives of those whose roles shaped the city's spiritual and social order. It is within these spaces of authority, reverence, and ritual purpose that the next part of Cahokia's story unfolds. On the broad expanse of Cahokia's central landscape, the elevated world of its leaders and ceremonial families rose in quiet contrast to the hum of daily life below. Atop the great mounds, where breezes moved freely across open platforms and sunlight spilled gently over packed earth, the elite households maintained a rhythm shaped not by field labor or workshop craft, but by ceremony, stewardship, and the steady weight of responsibility. The height of these mounds offered a vantage point over the city, allowing those who lived above to observe the movement of people along paths, the shifting shadows of wooden structures, and the long, unbroken line of the river flowing beyond the settlement's edge. Their homes, though constructed from the same materials used elsewhere, woven mats, thatched roofs, timber frames, carried subtle refinements. Roof beams were carefully selected and placed with precise spacing. Walls were plastered with fine clay smoothed until they held a soft, muted sheen in the morning light. Openings were arranged to allow breezes to drift through rooms, carrying the scent of grasses, distant fires, and cooling earth. These elevated structures were not extravagant in outward appearance, yet they conveyed a quiet distinction through design, craftsmanship, and the sense of calm order that surrounded them. Life atop the mounds moved with a measured, deliberate pace. From early morning onward, attendants tended small hearths that burned with controlled flame, warming spaces for gatherings and preparing meals whose aromas drifted softly through shaded corridors. Ceremonial objects rested on stands within these rooms, bundles wrapped in woven cloth, carved wooden effigies representing spiritual forces, and vessels filled with pigments or herbs. Each item held significance known to those who maintained them, and their placement reflected careful adherence to long-standing tradition. The occupants of these elevated homes, leaders, priests, advisors, and influential families, wore garments woven from refined fibers and decorated with patterns symbolizing lineage, role, or spiritual connection. Feathers, beads, and copper ornaments adorned clothing or were woven into hair, catching light and delicate glimmers as their wearers moved through sunlit spaces. Yet even these adornments, though beautiful, remained subtle. The elite favored muted elegance over extravagance, expressing status through precision rather than excess. Their days unfolded through a cycle of meetings, observances, and quiet administrative tasks. Ritual specialists visited often, carrying news of seasonal signs, reports from fields, or interpretations of dreams that required thoughtful consideration. Advisors arrived bearing records of resource allocation, trade interactions, or ceremonial obligations. Within shaded meeting spaces, these discussions unfolded slowly, shaped by a shared understanding of the city's delicate balance. Voices remained low, and decisions emerged gradually, carried by thoughtful pauses and long-standing relationships of trust. Ceremony formed a central part of elite life. At certain times of year, members of the ruling class participated in rituals held on mound summits, where the open sky provided a vast and unbroken dome above them. Offerings were placed on carefully prepared surfaces, bowls of ground pigment, bundles of feathers, shaped stones, or vessels containing seeds or water. The participants moved with deliberate choreography, guided by patterns handed down through generations. Their gestures, slow and measured, mirrored the movements of the natural world around them, the drifting of clouds, the sway of tall grass, the rhythmic flow of the river. Through these rituals, the elites embodied the connection between earth, sky, and community. The elevated households also functioned as centers of communication. Messengers arrived from distant settlements with news carried across rivers and forests. Their journeys ended at the base of the mound, where attendants received them and guided them upward in a slow ascent. Conversations unfolded with calm formality, acknowledging alliances, trade requests, or shared ceremonial obligations. These exchanges reinforced a network of relationships that extended far beyond Cahokia's immediate borders, binding distant communities through shared ritual language and mutual respect. Within private quarters, families of the elite lived in environments shaped by quiet stability. Children played in safe enclosed spaces near shaded verandas, their activities watched by attendants who ensured they remained within the boundaries of ritual expectations. Elders, seated near entrances where light filtered gently across the floor, shared stories that blended memory, myth, and instruction. These stories, spoken in low, steady tones, passed cultural understanding from one generation to the next, forming the foundation upon which the next leaders would build their worldview. Food prepared for elite households reflected the settlement's abundance, yet meals unfolded without extravagance. Bowls of maize, squash, beans, and fruits were arranged in orderly sequences, accompanied at times by fish or game prepared with subtle seasonings. Ceramic vessels displayed more refined shapes, their surfaces smoothed and decorated with restrained patterns. Meals were taken in calm surroundings, often accompanied by discussions of ceremonial timing, seasonal observations, or distant trade. Evenings brought a serene stillness to the elevated homes. As the sky deepened into shades of violet and the fires of the city glowed in scattered clusters below, the mound summits transformed into quiet sanctuaries. The elite gathered along the edges of the platforms, observing the flickering lights that spread across the settlement like constellations reflected upon the earth. The distant sounds of drums carried softly upward, slow, patient rhythms marking the close of the day. Breezes cooled the air, rustling woven mats and carrying faint scents of night blossoms. In these hours, the elites entered states of gentle reflection, contemplating cycles that governed both human and celestial realms. The contrast between life atop the mounds and life in the neighborhoods below was subtle rather than stark. No harsh division separated rulers from farmers, ritual specialists from craftspeople. Instead, the distinction arose through responsibility and symbolic connection. Those who lived at the summit existed not above the people, but within the symbolic heart of the community, guided by norms that shaped their movements, speech, and decisions. They lived close to the sky, yet their lives were bound deeply to the earth. Over time, as new leaders emerged and older ones stepped back into more private roles, the elevated households maintained their continuity. Ceremonial duties shifted from one individual to another, roles transitioning through quiet rites of passage marked by soft chants, offerings, and shared reflection. The architecture atop the mounds changed slowly, repaired and renewed with each generation, ensuring that the structures remained aligned with celestial cycles and community needs. Through these elevated lives, Cahokia's ideals took form, expressed not through grand displays of wealth or power, but through measured care, ceremonial precision, and a deep commitment to the harmony of the city. This world, perched above the broad floodplain, embodied the symbolic balance that guided Cahokia's existence, serving as both anchor and horizon for the community below. As the elevated households moved through their days, their presence formed a steady axis within the wider life of the settlement. Their actions, though quiet, guided the ebb and flow of activity across Cahokia, shaping the city's ceremonial calendar and influencing the rhythms that touched every household. The great mounds stood as physical representations of the roles they embodied, broad foundations rising gently toward the horizon, anchoring the social and spiritual order with their immovable, enduring form. On certain mornings, as the first pale bands of light appeared along the eastern sky, attendants ascended the mound's ramp, carrying items wrapped in woven cloth. Their footsteps pressed softly into the earth, leaving faint impressions that would fade by midday. At the summit, They unwrapped each object with careful reverence. Some were carved from wood, their surfaces smoothed by years of handling. Others were shaped from polished stone or hammered copper, their reflective surfaces catching the early sun in brief glints of warmth. These objects held symbolic weight within rituals that required precise placement and timing, forming a quiet dialogue between the human world and the movements of the sky. The elites who oversaw these rituals approached the platform in slow procession, their garments moving gently with the morning wind. Their expressions remained calm, shaped by the understanding that ceremony was not performance, but alignment, an attunement between people, place, and the cycles that defined existence. They stepped toward positions designated long ago by elders and ritual specialists, standing in silence as light shifted across the landscape. When the sun rose fully above the horizon, its rays passed through specific openings or aligned with particular markers, signaling the moment for the ritual to begin. Soft chants followed, low, steady tones that drifted across the open ground and dissolved into the morning air. These sounds, though subdued, carried deep significance. They acknowledged the forces believed to guide seasons, protect crops, and maintain harmony among households. The language of the chants, refined through generations, echoed across the mound summit with a quiet persistence, weaving the voices of the living with the presence of the ancestors. Below, people in the plaza paused their tasks momentarily, sensing the subtle shift that accompanied these rituals, even if they did not witness them directly. Beyond ceremonial duties, the elites engaged in communal decision-making that unfolded through slow, thoughtful discussions. They gathered inside large meeting houses constructed atop the mounds, where thick wooden posts supported wide roofs that filtered sunlight into soft, dappled patterns. Mats woven from reeds covered the floor, their designs indicating clan affiliations or historical lineage. Advisors sat in deliberate arrangement, forming a circle that encouraged balanced dialogue, where each member contributed insights drawn from personal experience or inherited knowledge. Voices rose and fell without haste, their tones level and composed. These meetings addressed matters that shaped the settlement's stability, adjustments to planting schedules based on observed rainfall, the distribution of surplus resources after a particularly abundant harvest, or the coordination of long-distance exchanges with communities connected by river and forest. Decisions did not emerge from sudden directives. They unfolded like the slow branching of a tree root, extending through layers of conversation until a consensus took shape. This communal approach ensured that leadership remained grounded in collective wisdom rather than individual assertion. At times, the daily routines of elite families included periods of instruction, where younger members learned the symbolic meanings behind objects, gestures, and architectural alignments. Elders guided them through quiet lessons conducted in shaded areas where wind rustled softly through reed mats. They demonstrated the proper way to handle ceremonial objects, explaining the significance of each carved line or feathered accent. They repeated certain motions with deliberate slowness, allowing learners to internalize not just the movements, but the calm presence required in ritual. These lessons formed the foundation for future leadership, ensuring that knowledge survived through generations without disruption. Meanwhile, The elevated households also served as guardians of trade items that carried both material and symbolic significance. Copper sheets from the Great Lakes region rested in storage rooms, their shimmering surfaces tarnished only slightly by time. Marine shells from distant coasts lay in woven baskets, each one polished to a soft sheen. Mica pieces, thin and translucent, reflected light in delicate patterns along the mound summit when held at certain angles. These objects connected Cahokia to a vast network of distant lands, reinforcing the city's role as a center of regional interaction. Even during moments of rest, the atmosphere atop the mounds held an air of quiet purpose. Afternoons brought long shadows that stretched across rooftops and pathways, casting the city in warm hues. Breezes flowed steadily, cooling the elevated platforms and carrying the scent of drying grass and river mud. Families gathered beneath roofed areas designed to block intense sunlight, their conversations unfolding in muted tones. Children played with carved toys fashioned from wood or fired clay, their gentle movements echoing the calm pace of elite households. Small groups of adolescents practiced ritual steps under the guidance of elders, learning to move with the controlled grace expected of those who might later take on ceremonial roles. As dusk approached, the mounds transformed once more, taking on a solemn beauty as the sky shifted toward deeper blues and purples. Fires sparked to life within sheltered hearths, their warm glow illuminating polished objects and casting soft shadows along walls. The night air filled with a blend of faint fragrances, smoke from burning wood, the earthy scent of compacted soil, and the delicate aroma of plants carried on the evening wind. From the city below, the slow rhythm of drums rose upward, blending with the quiet activities of the elite families above. When darkness settled fully, the elevated households often gathered at the edges of their platforms to watch the stars emerge. The sky, vast and unbroken, stretched out across the horizon, its constellations shifting slowly overhead. Ritual specialists identified familiar patterns, tracing them with calm gestures. Younger members listened attentively as elders explained how the cycles of stars guided planting seasons, shaped ceremonial timing, and marked key transitions within the year. These nighttime gatherings formed a bridge between the human world and the cosmic order that governed Cahokia's ceremonial life. In this elevated world, calm, deliberate, and steeped in meaning, the elites of Cahokia fulfilled roles that balanced the spiritual, social, and practical needs of the settlement. Their actions shaped the city's heartbeat, guiding the flow of seasons, ceremonies, and communal life. Though time eventually softened their influence and blurred the details of their daily routines, the traces of their presence remained embedded in the mounds themselves, rising above the floodplain as enduring symbols of leadership, harmony, and the intricate complexity of Cahokia's world. As seasons drifted across the landscape, the elevated world atop Cahokia's mounds continued to move according to its own measured rhythm, gentle, deliberate, and deeply intertwined with the ceremonial heart of the city. At certain times of year, this elevated sphere became a place of heightened preparation, as upcoming observances required careful coordination. Ritual specialists arrived with bundles wrapped in river reed mats, their contents known only to those entrusted with ceremonial duties. The unwrapping of these bundles took place with quiet reverence, revealing objects imbued with symbolic meaning: carved pipes, polished stone blades not intended for use, and gourds filled with seeds that represented renewal and continuity. In shaded areas behind the summit dwellings, attendants prepared spaces for these ceremonies by smoothing the packed earth with wide wooden paddles. Their movements were steady and unhurried, producing a flat, uniform surface that caught the light in soft, even tones. They arranged stones along the edges in subtle patterns, their positions marking symbolic directions or points associated with celestial events. Sometimes they constructed small windbreaks or screens woven from willow branches, allowing breezes to flow through while shielding the ceremonial objects from direct sunlight. As preparations unfolded, elite women contributed equally to the world atop the mounds. Skilled weavers produced intricate textiles from plant fibers, their patterns representing lineage, seasons, or spiritual themes. These textiles adorned the ceremonial spaces, framing altars or hanging along the interior walls of meeting houses where rituals would occur. Their colors, soft reds, deep ochres, muted greens, mingled harmoniously with the natural hues of the earth and the sky. Elite women also played roles in maintaining the ceremonial objects themselves, repairing worn bindings, refreshing faded pigments, and preparing offerings that required delicate handling. When the time for major ceremonies arrived, the elevated platforms filled with a subdued yet palpable anticipation. Groups moved into position with a quiet precision that reflected long training and deep familiarity with tradition. Priests, adorned with feathered headdresses or body paint drawn from sacred pigments, stepped into arranged patterns that corresponded with the shifting position of the sun. Their shadows stretched across the platform, lengthening or contracting with the changing light. The movement of these shadows formed part of the ritual, marking moments when chants shifted, offerings were placed, or smoke was released into the air through shallow bowls of smoldering herbs. The scents that rose from these ceremonies carried delicate complexity. Fragrances of sweetgrass, crushed leaves, and dried petals that mingled with the smoke of carefully prepared fires. The aromas drifted across the mound and down toward the city below, signaling the unfolding of significant events even to those who could not witness them directly. In the plaza, families paused their tasks for a moment, sensing the faint presence of ritual high above, faint as a whispered memory carried on the wind. Beyond religious observances, the elite households maintained steady oversight of important resources. Storage rooms within the summit dwellings held finely crafted tools and materials that required protection. Copper axes used only in rituals, mica sheets stored between layers of cloth, carefully shaped stone discs whose purpose remained partly symbolic. Attendants checked these stores regularly, inspecting each item with calm care, ensuring that the materials remained intact and ready for use when ceremonies called for them. In addition to managing resources, the elites coordinated major construction projects, such as the renewal of mound surfaces or the raising of new wooden structures in ceremonial zones. Discussions regarding these projects unfolded over weeks, with ritual specialists consulting astronomical markers and planners studying the contours of the land. Builders worked in teams, each individual performing their task in slow, steady coordination. From the mound summits, elites watched the progress with quiet attention, their gazes following the movement of workers carrying baskets filled with soil or carefully placing logs into prepared trenches. The elevated households also served as guardians of knowledge. Within private areas of their dwellings, elders recorded memories not through writing, but through objects, arrangements, and stories repeated many times in calm, steady voices. Younger members listened while seated in circles, absorbing lessons that combined practical guidance with cosmological understanding. Through these unhurried conversations, knowledge flowed like a quiet river, steady, patient, and enduring. As night settled over the city, the world atop the mounds transformed once again into a place of reflection. Flames flickered in the hearths, casting gentle patterns across walls that swayed with the evening breeze. The elites stepped out onto open platforms, gazing upward as stars drifted slowly into place. Some nights, the sky appeared unusually clear, and constellations aligned with markers carved into wooden posts or etched into ceremonial objects. On such nights, the air felt charged with quiet significance, as though the city's spiritual architecture aligned perfectly with the celestial map above. Through all these moments, ceremony, governance, teaching, reflection, the elevated world maintained its serene continuity. In its calm rituals and measured decisions, it shaped the identity of Cahokia just as profoundly as the bustling neighborhoods below. The mounds, rising gently above the floodplain, stood as symbols of this influence, steadfast, ancient, and enduring, holding within their heights the stories of those who lived closest to the sky. As life atop the great mounds continued in its measured rhythm, guided by ceremony, quiet governance, and the steady observation of celestial patterns, the world beyond Cahokia's immediate boundaries moved with a parallel calmness. Rivers drifted through forests and marshlands in slow, winding paths. Trails worn by generations extended outward from the city, threading through prairies, low hills, and woodlands that stretched toward distant communities. The elevated households, though rooted firmly in the ceremonial heart of Cahokia, remained deeply aware of these far-reaching networks. Their decisions, rituals, and responsibilities existed not in isolation, but in dialogue with landscapes and settlements far beyond the visible horizon. Materials arriving from distant regions, gleaming copper from northern lakes, shells from southern shores, stones from far-off quarries, reminded the elites that Cahokia functioned as part of a broader tapestry, connected through waterways, trade routes, and shared traditions carried from generation to generation. Messages drifted into the city by canoe or by foot, bearing news of shifting seasons, alliances, or events unfolding hundreds of miles away. These connections, though slow-moving, shaped the city's understanding of its place within a vast, interwoven world. And so, from the elevated spaces where rituals shaped the city's inner life, the narrative now moves outward, toward the wider sphere of exchange, travel, belief, and subtle influence that linked Cahokia to regions near and far. It is in this broader landscape of contact and quiet movement that the next portion of the story unfolds. Beyond the wide mounds and settled neighborhoods of Cahokia, the world stretched outward in long, unhurried distances shaped by rivers, forests, and the gentle rise of distant hills. These landscapes formed the connective tissue through which goods, stories, and people traveled. Though movement across these regions unfolded at a slow, steady pace, their influence extended far, reaching communities that lived days or even weeks away. Cahokia functioned as both a destination and a point of departure within this vast web. Its presence recognized across the Mississippi Valley and beyond. The river served as the primary artery of connection. Along its broad, shimmering surface, canoes carved gentle paths that reflected the steady labor of paddlers moving in rhythm with the current. Traders approached Cahokia from upstream and downstream, guided by the subtle signs of the water, shifts in flow, the spiraling circles created by fish near the surface, and the quiet tug of eddies along the banks. Each canoe carried goods wrapped carefully in hides or woven mats, their surfaces marked with the traces of long journeys. Upon arrival, the traders guided their vessels toward narrow inlets where reeds grew in dense clusters, anchoring them beneath the shade of leaning willows. As they stepped ashore, their presence added new threads to Cahokia's expansive tapestry of interaction. The goods they carried represented landscapes far beyond the city's fertile plain. Copper from the Great Lakes region glimmered with a muted luster, shaped into sheets or tools through expert hammering. Shells from coastlines hundreds of miles away displayed spiraling interiors and soft iridescence, prized for both beauty and symbolic meaning. Chunks of obsidian or chert, carried from distant quarries, bore colors and textures unlike those found locally. These items, though modest in appearance, embodied long histories of movement, exchange, and quiet negotiation between communities. When traders entered the city, attendants guided them toward designated meeting areas, open spaces beneath the shade of tall trees or sheltered structures near the base of the mounds. Here, discussions unfolded in soft tones. Goods were unwrapped with deliberate care, inspected not for luxury, but for their practicality, durability, and symbolic significance. Cahokian representatives offered their own items in return: finely crafted pottery, polished stone tools, textiles woven with intricate patterns, and foodstuffs cultivated in the rich soil of the floodplain. These exchanges emphasized balance and mutual respect, reinforcing bonds that carried both economic and ceremonial value. The exchange of goods was only one aspect of interaction. Stories traveled with the traders, narratives of distant storms, changes in the growth cycles of faraway crops, sightings of unusual animals, or the outcomes of ceremonies held beneath different skies. These stories drifted through Cahokia like quiet breezes, influencing understandings of the wider world. Ritual specialists listened with careful attention, noting signs that might hold cosmological meaning. Leaders considered the implications for future ceremonies or agricultural planning. Through these gentle exchanges, knowledge moved across vast distances, binding communities into a shared, though unspoken, understanding of the land. Beyond the river routes, footpaths extended outward from Cahokia in narrow trails worn smooth by generations of travel. These paths wound through forest groves, where sunlight filtered through dense leaves, casting shifting patterns of green and gold upon the ground. They crossed open prairies where grasses brushed gently against the legs of travelers, and where the sound of wind became the primary companion for long stretches of the journey. They descended into valleys where streams flowed in clear, steady currents, their surfaces broken occasionally by the glimmer of passing fish. Along these trails, small encampments offered resting places, patches of ground cleared long ago where travelers paused to share food or stories. Communities along these paths maintained relationships with Cahokia that blended trade with cultural exchange. They sent representatives to participate in ceremonies, sometimes carrying objects meant as offerings. They received envoys from Cahokia in return, welcoming them into their dwellings with quiet hospitality and sharing insights about their own seasonal cycles. These connections formed a web of interactions that extended across the central and eastern regions of the continent, creating a network bound not by conquest or domination, but by mutual recognition and shared cosmology. Important ideas traveled these routes as well. Concepts of alignment between earth and sky, practices of mound construction, and patterns of ceremonial dance moved from one community to another, reshaped by each group according to local traditions. Cahokia stood at the center of this exchange, both influencing and being influenced by the cultural currents that flowed across the region. The city's ceremonial specialists incorporated new insights into their rituals, adjusting positions of wooden posts, reinterpreting symbolic arrangements, or refining the timing of certain observances. These adjustments represented not innovation for innovation's sake, but the continuous evolution of a living cultural system. Even natural forces played a role in the subtle movement of materials and ideas. Floodwaters redistributed soil and plant matter across the floodplain, carrying seeds to new locations and depositing traces of distant landscapes along Cahokia's edges. Winds pushed pollen from faraway flowers into the region, introducing new scents and subtle shifts in the composition of local vegetation. Migratory birds, passing overhead in slow, undulating formations, linked Cahokia to distant lands through their predictable yet mysterious routes. The people of the city observed these movements closely, interpreting them as signs embedded within the broader rhythm of the world. Through the seasons, traders from distant regions became familiar figures moving through Cahokia's central pathways. Some traveled repeatedly along the same river routes, arriving each year with new goods and familiar stories. Others appeared only occasionally, their presence marking rare but meaningful contact with faraway lands. Their voices carried accents shaped by different landscapes, their clothing adorned with patterns inspired by distant traditions. As they moved along Cahokia's plazas, their presence blended into the slow rhythm of daily life, adding small variations to the city's atmosphere without disturbing its calm. Within dedicated exchange spaces, conversations unfolded between Cahokian representatives and visiting traders. These exchanges took the form of ritualized interaction rather than simple negotiation. Items were presented with careful gestures, held briefly in the light for examination, and placed upon woven mats that acted as neutral ground between groups. Observers noted the shape of a shell, the weight of a copper sheet, or the polish of a tool, considering both its material worth and its symbolic resonance. These exchanges strengthened bonds of trust, ensuring that movement between communities remained steady, predictable, and grounded in shared respect. Between formal exchanges, quiet moments of interaction carried their own significance. A trader might notice a newly constructed structure atop one of the mounds and ask gently about its purpose. A Cahokian elder might inquire about the timing of the last flood far upstream or the success of a distant harvest. These small conversations created links between communities that were neither alliances nor obligations, but a softer, more enduring relationship, grounded in simple human continuity. Beyond material exchange, shared ceremonial practices traveled these routes as well. Distant communities brought with them stories of rituals held beside their own rivers, under their own skies, or atop their own earthen mounds. Cahokian specialists listened closely to these accounts, intrigued not by novelty, but by the ways these distant practices reflected common understandings of the world. Some stories describe dances designed to honor changing seasons. Others spoke of offerings placed near sacred stones or beneath ancient trees. Though each community shaped its traditions in unique ways, certain themes, respect for ancestors, acknowledgement of celestial cycles, gratitude for the land, echoed across all these narratives. Such resonances strengthened the sense that Cahokia existed within a larger, interconnected spiritual landscape. Some forms of contact emerged through chance rather than deliberate exchange. Storms occasionally sent driftwood and debris down the river, carrying unfamiliar objects that washed ashore near the settlement. Travelers encountering unusual stones or shells along the banks might bring them to ritual specialists who considered their origins with care. Even the currents themselves carried meanings, as shifts in water clarity, temperature, or wildlife signaled distant changes in climate or resource availability. Through such chance encounters, the world beyond Cahokia revealed itself, offering reminders that the city existed within a vast and interconnected environment. These networks of exchange, whether deliberate or accidental, did more than support the material needs of Cahokia. They enriched its ceremonial life, deepened its cosmology, and broadened the horizons of its leaders. Each good received, each story shared, and each sign interpreted contributed to a quiet, ongoing dialogue between Cahokia and the wider world. And in this dialogue, the city found both affirmation and transformation, its identity shaped through the steady, unhurried movement of objects and ideas across the North American landscape. As these networks of movement and meaning extended outward from Cahokia, the city itself responded in gentle ways to the rhythm of contact with distant communities. Each arrival of traders, each return of travelers, and each quiet report of events beyond the horizon gradually shaped the ceremonial and practical choices made within the settlement. The mounds, the plazas, and the wooden circles absorbed these influences as subtly as soil absorbs rainfall, transforming slowly over time while maintaining the deep, enduring character that defined the city. In the cool hours before dawn, long before traders appeared along the riverbank or travelers set foot upon the outer trails, the ceremonial leaders gathered to observe the sky. Stars still glimmered in their slow arcs across the heavens, their fading light reflecting upon the surface of nearby ponds. As the first hints of morning brightened the horizon, ritual specialists considered the celestial signs that guided the timing of planting, exchange, and major observances. A slight shift in the brightness of a particular star cluster, or the early return of migratory birds, might suggest subtle adjustments to upcoming ceremonies. These signs, interpreted with deep care, formed part of an ever-changing tapestry woven from the combined influence of the natural world and the expanding network beyond the city. These exchanges sometimes inspired subtle shifts in ceremonial practice. A new arrangement of offerings might reflect a symbol learned from a traveling group. A particular song, carried across hundreds of miles, might find its way into Cahokian ritual spaces, its tones blending with the deep rhythms of local drums. Even the architecture atop the mounds occasionally reflected these gentle influences, incorporating alignments or design elements that acknowledge distant places or shared cosmological interpretations. Yet none of these changes disrupted the city's identity. They simply layered new meaning upon old patterns, allowing tradition to deepen rather than fracture. Natural forces continued to contribute to this network of connection. During high water seasons, the river carried branches, seeds, and fragments of distant landscapes toward Cahokia, depositing them along its banks. Ritual specialists sometimes collected these objects with quiet reverence, interpreting them as signs from faraway lands. Messages carried not by traders, but by the currents themselves. A seed from a plant not found locally might be planted in a sheltered garden, tended with care, and studied for its potential ceremonial use. Driftwood with unusual patterns might be placed near a ritual space, valued not for its utility, but for the suggestion that distant regions touched Cahokia through the river's slow, steady journey. When storms swept across the floodplain, travelers paused their journeys and temporarily sought shelter in communities along the way. These unplanned gatherings became moments of peaceful exchange, time when travelers from different regions shared stories while waiting for rainfall to diminish or winds to settle. Such moments created unexpected bridges between communities, forming connections that later found their way to Cahokia through the quiet retelling of these encounters. Through all these interactions, deliberate and accidental, the city gained a broader awareness of the world beyond its boundaries. Its leaders adjusted ceremonial schedules according to distant signs. Its artisans refined their designs through exposure to new materials, and its ritual specialists deepened their interpretations of cosmological patterns through stories carried by travelers. The great mounds, rising steadily above the plain, absorbed this knowledge in their symbolic presence. The plazas below witnessed the continuous, gentle movement of goods and ideas, reflecting the steady pulse of connection that flowed across the region. In this extended network of exchange and understanding, Cahokia existed not as an isolated settlement, but as a central point in a vast, multi-layered constellation of communities. The city's heartbeat resonated outward through river routes, footpaths, and stories, touching distant lands in ways both subtle and enduring. And in return, the world flowed gently into Cahokia, shaping its ceremonies, enriching its knowledge, and deepening its sense of belonging within a landscape that stretched far beyond the visible horizon. As generations continued their slow passage across the floodplain, the networks that linked Cahokia to distant landscapes expanded and contracted like quiet breaths drawn across the continent. The movement of canoes along the river, the steady footsteps along narrow woodland trails, and the gentle drift of stories exchanged at encampments all contributed to a shifting mosaic of connection. Goods, ideas, and symbolic meanings flowed steadily into the city's heart, while Cahokia's own traditions radiated outward, carried by travelers who followed familiar paths beneath the changing sky. Yet even as these exchanges shaped the city's understanding of the world beyond its borders, another rhythm unfolded within Cahokia, one not defined by trade or movement, but by a deeper continuity that anchored the community to the land itself. Beneath the towering mounds and carefully maintained plazas, a quieter narrative formed, shaped by the passing of seasons, the rise and fall of generations, and the gradual return of the city's stories to the earth. The mounds, long associated with ceremony and leadership, began to shift from centers of active life to monuments of memory. Winds brushed their surfaces, carrying away the sharp edges of their construction and leaving gentle contours shaped by time. Grass grew thicker along their slopes, softening the boundaries between built landscape and natural plain. Plazas that once echoed with ritual footsteps fell into deeper stillness. The pathways continued to hold their form, but the footsteps that had defined them grew fewer with each passing season. Beyond the city's boundaries, the river continued its patient journey, flowing past the now quieter settlement with the same calm persistence it had carried for centuries. Birds still circled above the marshlands. Storms still moved across the horizon in slow, deliberate sweeps, and the broad sky held the same celestial patterns that had guided countless ceremonies. These enduring rhythms remained constant even as the city's human presence began its gradual retreat from the floodplain. And so the narrative shifts one final time, from the movement of goods and stories across vast landscapes to the reflective quiet of a world settling back into silence. Segment 6 turns toward this stillness, toward the long arc of time that frames Cahokia's rise, its flourishing, and its gentle fading into memory. Within this closing perspective, the city becomes not only a place of earth and ceremony, but a symbol of cycles that have shaped human communities across ages. As the long centuries settled across the Mississippi floodplain, Cahokia's presence gradually softened into the landscape that had once sustained it. The great mounds, once bustling centers of ceremony and leadership, slowly yielded to the patient forces of wind, rain, and time. Grasses rooted themselves deeply in their slopes, weaving living threads through layers of earth shaped by countless hands. Without the daily footsteps of attendants and ritual specialists, the surfaces of the mounds grew quiet, holding only the faint rustle of wind and the occasional call of birds resting on their gentle rises. The plazas below, once filled with the sounds of gathering crowds and the steady rhythms of drums, took on the stillness of undeclared memory. Sunlight fell across their surfaces in soft, unbroken sheets, illuminating faint depressions in the earth where people had once walked in slow procession. These open spaces, shaped by centuries of communal life, gradually merged with the surrounding plain, their boundaries blurred by shifting soil and seasonal growth. Where once thousands had stood together to mark celestial cycles or honor leaders, the ground now held only silence and the quiet passage of shadows cast by drifting clouds. Yet even as human presence receded, the landscape itself retained the imprint of Cahokia's long story. The river continued its measured flow past the site, its currents unaware of the changes unfolding along its banks. Each year, it carried new layers of silt from distant lands, depositing them in gentle increments across the floodplain. Sedges and reeds swayed along its edges, their movements echoing the slow tempo that had always shaped this region. In the marshlands beyond, turtles continued their patient climbs onto sunlit logs, while birds moved in broad arcs across the sky. tracing routes that had connected distant worlds long before the city rose. Seasons layered themselves upon the mounds, forming cycles of renewal that unfolded quietly and without urgency. In spring, the first shoots of grass pierced the cooling soil, their pale green leaves trembling under the morning breeze. Summer brought tall, waving blades that cast rippling patterns across the slopes, their motion as calm and steady as the rituals once performed above. Autumn scattered dry leaves along the pathways that had once guided leaders and travelers. Winter laid a thin blanket of frost across the ground, softening every contour into quiet simplicity. Through these seasons, the mounds endured as silent reminders of a world that had shaped and been shaped by its inhabitants. Though the city's population eventually dispersed, the knowledge woven into its architecture and ceremonial rhythms did not disappear abruptly. Instead, it spread outward like faint ripples on the surface of a still pond, carried by families who traveled to new regions, by traders who followed familiar routes, and by communities who retained fragments of the old ceremonies within their own traditions. Traces of Cahokia's ideas echoed through stories told in distant settlements, stories of earthworks aligned to the sun, of gatherings held beneath open skies, and of leaders whose quiet presence had guided entire communities. Even in distant lands, the memory of Cahokia's world lived on through subtle influences. Mounds rose in other regions, shaped by hands that understood the significance of earth built upward toward the sky. Ceremonial plazas appeared in communities hundreds of miles away, their designs reflecting a shared understanding of space, direction, and celestial rhythm. Painted pottery bore patterns that may have carried echoes of Cahokian symbolism, even as they evolved within new cultural contexts. In this way, the city endured not through continuous habitation, but through the gradual diffusion of meaning carried across centuries. Archaeologists who arrived long after Cahokia's quiet fading approached the landscape with tools and questions that could only reveal part of the story. As they uncovered soil layers, analyzed artifacts, and mapped the outlines of ancient structures, they encountered a world that spoke in fragments. Soil stains where posts once stood, shards of pottery bearing faint marks, fragments of copper shaped by hands long gone. These remnants offered glimpses of Cahokia's past, but they did so in whispers, leaving the fuller meaning to emerge slowly through careful interpretation and contemplative reflection. Even so, the discoveries invited a sense of connection across time. The layers of earth beneath the mounds revealed cycles of construction that mirrored the cycles of ceremony and leadership. The remnants of woodhenge suggested an enduring devotion to celestial patterns. Burial offerings hinted at beliefs that connected the living with forces beyond the visible world. Every artifact added depth to the story, yet none provided a complete answer. The silence woven through the site remained as important as the evidence uncovered, reminding observers that some aspects of Cahokia's life were meant to dissolve into the land, carried only by the earth itself. As the modern world grew around the ancient site, the mounds remained a quiet presence on the horizon. Visitors walked the paths once shaped by countless feet, sensing the subtle pull of a history that extended beyond the reach of memory. The stillness of the place invited reflection, encouraging the imagination to drift gently along the edges of what was known and what remained unseen. The wind that moved across the mounds offered a soft, continuous reminder of the cycles that connected past and present, carrying with it the lingering echo of rituals performed beneath earlier skies. In this quiet space between memory and forgetting, the story of Cahokia found its final form, not as a single narrative that could be fully reconstructed, but as a constellation of impressions held loosely together by the land. It existed in the gentle rise of the mounds, in the long shadows cast by the sun, in the faint traces uncovered by slow, patient excavation. It lived in the rhythm of the river, the shimmer of distant forests, and the soft rustling of grass that brushed against the earth in endless waves. Through these subtle signs, the ancient city continued to speak, offering its story to those who approached with calm attention. As more centuries drifted across the floodplain, the mounds settled deeper into the quiet fabric of the land. Rainfall traced thin, silvery streams along their slopes, carving gentle channels that smoothed the edges where once builders had packed the earth with care. Wildflowers rooted themselves in small clusters across their surfaces, blooming each spring in muted tones of yellow and pale violet. Their petals opened with the morning light and closed in the cool hush of evening, completing small, delicate cycles that echoed the larger rhythms once observed by Cahokia's ceremonial specialists. These blooms, though ephemeral, formed a quiet continuation of the city's long-held relationship with the natural world. The surrounding plains embraced this slow transformation with equal softness. Trees grew where neighborhoods had once stood, their roots threading through old house floors and ceremonial spaces. In some places, the soil carried faint traces of charcoal from ancient hearths. In others, the imprint of woven mats remained pressed into the earth beneath layers of sediment. These subtle marks persisted only in silence, holding stories not written in language but preserved through texture, shadow, and the way light brushed across uneven ground. As animals moved through the landscape, deer stepping through tall grass, birds gliding above the river, the traces of Cahokia's past blended peacefully with the rhythms of the present. The river, ever patient, continued to shift its channels in slow, imperceptible arcs. During certain years, its waters rose high enough to touch the edges of old fields, depositing fresh layers of silt that softened the contours of ancient boundaries. During others, it receded, exposing sandbars and mudflats that glistened beneath the sun. These changes, unfolding across centuries, erased some of the city's marks while preserving others beneath layers of sediment. In this way, the river acted as both a keeper and a gentle eraser of memory, shaping the landscape with the same steady persistence that had guided the people of Cahokia through countless generations. Through all these shifts, the site remained a place where time felt layered rather than linear. The mounds stood as quiet witnesses to each transformation, their broad forms rising like slow, steady breaths from the earth. They absorbed the changing seasons, the migrating birds, the drifting pollen, and the soft tread of occasional visitors who paused to contemplate the landscape. The air around them carried a subdued resonance, shaped not by sounds, but by the stillness that settled across the open ground. Archaeologists who arrived in more recent centuries took careful note of each subtle clue: small depressions in the soil, fragments of pottery polished by time, pieces of worked stone found beneath layers of silt. their tools brushed lightly across the earth, revealing hints of structures, pathways, and ceremonial features long hidden. The work unfolded slowly, mirroring the city's own ancient rhythms. Each discovery offered a brief flicker of understanding, but the full breadth of Cahokia's story remained gently out of reach, preserved in the quiet spaces between artifacts. Scholars reflected upon the city's rise and decline with thoughtful restraint. They recognized that no single cause explained its fading, and that the truth rested in the quiet interweaving of many factors: changing climate, shifting resources, evolving cultural ties, and the natural cycles of communities that grow, flourish, and eventually transform. Cahokia's passing was not abrupt, nor was it marked by conflict or collapse. Instead, it unfolded as a gradual softening, much like the mounds themselves eroding into rounded forms shaped by countless sunsets and storms. In this final reflection, Cahokia became not only a place of history, but a reminder of the gentle impermanence that touches all human landscapes. Its memory endured through the shapes of the mounds, through the faint traces preserved in soil, and through the quiet sense of continuity that emerged from the land itself. As the wind moved across the floodplain, it carried with it the softened echoes of a city that once rose in remarkable harmony with sky, earth, and time. As the final traces of Cahokia's story drift softly into stillness, the landscape settles once more beneath the quiet rhythm of the passing night. The great mounds remain as calm silhouettes against the horizon, their rounded forms blending with the soft glow of fading daylight. A gentle breeze moves across the open plain, brushing through tall grasses that sway in slow, unhurried waves. The river continues its patient course nearby, its surface reflecting faint glimmers of the evening sky, carrying the same quiet persistence that shaped the lives of those who once walked these grounds. Shadows lengthen along the slopes, merging into the deepening blue of dusk. The sounds of the world grow muted, leaving only the subdued whisper of wind and the distant chorus of insects rising into the night. In this peaceful silence, the memory of the ancient city lingers without urgency, held in the contours of earth shaped by steady, purposeful hands long ago. The mounds, the plazas, and the shifting paths remain part of the landscape's gentle breath, carrying echoes of a world that lived in harmony with soil, sky, and time. As darkness settles fully, the stars emerge one by one, casting pale light across the quiet floodplain. Their presence mirrors the enduring rhythms that guided Cahokia's ceremonies and cycles, their steady glow offering a final reminder of the continuity that stretches across ages. And in this stillness, the story comes to rest, unhurried, unbroken, and softly folded into the quiet embrace of the night.